She stood near the back of the small room, holding a thin paper invitation in her hand. Felt unreal to her. Just a few days ago, she was playing on an old piano in a quiet community hall where only a few people would listen. Now, she had been invited to perform at a formal public event where many important guests would attend. She was not a famous performer. She was not trained in a big music school. She was simply someone who loved the piano since childhood and played from the heart more than from books. The invitation had come unexpectedly. One of the organizers had once heard her play at a small gathering. At that time, she had thought no one even noticed her performance. But someone had. And now she was here, standing in a much bigger place, surrounded by people who seemed far more confident and experienced than her. The hall where the event was being prepared was large and beautifully decorated. Soft golden lights hung from above. Chairs were being arranged in neat rows. People were walking around with clipboards, speaking quickly and checking schedules. Everything felt fast and important. She, on the other hand, felt quiet inside, almost invisible in such a busy space. When she first approached the event desk, a staff member barely looked at her. They asked for her name, checked a list, and pointed her toward a waiting area. There was no warm welcome, no special attention, just instructions. She did not mind. She was used to being unnoticed. Later, one of the organizers came to speak with her. The conversation was short and direct. They told her she would be performing a simple piano piece between two main performances. It would not be the highlight of the evening. It would only be a short transition moment, something light to fill the gap. They explained that the audience would not expect anything complex. In fact, they suggested she keep it very simple, something soft and familiar, nothing emotional or dramatic. She listened carefully and nodded. She did not argue. She did not try to prove anything. She simply agreed. Inside, she felt no disappointment. She had never come to prove she was better than anyone. She had come because music was the only language she truly understood. Whether it was a big stage or a small room did not matter to her. The piano was enough. As she was guided backstage, she noticed the difference between her and the other performers. They were dressed in elegant clothing, speaking confidently, laughing with ease. They seemed comfortable in attention. She, however, wore simple clothes and kept her hands folded most of the time. She did not try to fit into their world. She simply observed it quietly. A few of the staff members looked at her with mild curiosity. Some assumed she was just a backup performer, someone who filled empty space in programs like this. No one asked her about her experience. No one seemed interested in her background, and she did not offer any explanation. While waiting, she found a quiet corner near the stage curtains. From there, she could hear the audience slowly entering the hall. The sound of footsteps, soft conversations, and chairs being adjusted filled the space. It created a growing energy, like a wave slowly building up. She closed her eyes for a moment. Her mind did not think about impressing anyone. Instead, she thought about the piano she had grown up with. It was not perfect. Some keys were slightly uneven. Some sounds were softer than others. But it had been her comfort during difficult times. Whenever she felt alone or overwhelmed, she would sit and play without any plan, just letting her feelings flow through her fingers. That was what she carried with her now. Not confidence in performance, but honesty in music. As the event continued, she could hear applause from the stage. One performance followed another. Each one seemed polished and practiced. The audience reacted politely, clapping at the right moments. Everything felt structured and controlled. But she noticed something else too. The reactions were polite, but not deeply emotional. It was as if everyone was following a routine. Then her moment slowly approached. A staff member came and told her she would be next. The words were simple, almost casual. She nodded and stood up. Her heart beat a little faster now, but not out of fear. It was more like awareness. She was stepping into something larger than herself, something she could not control. She walked toward the side of the stage. From there, she could see the audience clearly. The hall was filled with people. Some were still talking softly. Some were looking at their phones. Some were waiting for the next main act. Very few seemed focused on what was about to happen. She took a slow breath. The piano had already been placed on stage. It was positioned slightly off-center, not in the spotlight. It was not the newest instrument. Its surface showed signs of use. But to her, it did not matter. When her name, or rather her turn, was announced, she stepped forward. There was no dramatic entrance. No announcement of talent. Just a simple introduction as someone performing a short piece. She walked carefully across the stage. Her footsteps were soft. The lights above felt warm but distant. The audience watched her with mild interest, not expecting anything unusual. She sat down in front of the piano. For a moment, she placed her hands on her lap. She looked at the keys in front of her. They were quiet, waiting. In that silence, something inside her settled. She was no longer thinking about the audience or the event or the expectations. She was simply present. She lifted her hands slowly and placed them on the keys. The first note she played was soft, almost fragile. It did not demand attention. It simply existed in the space. At first, the audience barely reacted. A few people continued whispering. Others adjusted in their seats. It was exactly what had been expected. A simple tune, nothing more. But she continued. And as she continued, something subtle began to shift, though no one could explain it yet. The sound did not stay simple for long. It began to carry something deeper, something that could not be described easily. It was still gentle, but now it had weight. It felt like it was telling a story without words. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully, as if they were remembering something instead of performing it. Each note seemed connected to something personal, something unseen. The room was still not fully quiet, but a few people had started to notice that something felt different. Not loud, not dramatic, just different in a way that made them pause for a second. She did not look at the audience. She did not look at anything beyond the piano. Her entire attention was inside the music. And slowly, without anyone realizing it fully, the atmosphere in the hall began to change. Backstage, the air felt different from the rest of the hall. It was quieter, but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that carried pressure in it, like everyone was holding their breath without realizing it. People moved quickly, checking schedules, adjusting outfits, speaking in short sentences that sounded more like instructions than conversations. She remained near the side, still waiting for her moment. Her hands were calm now, resting lightly together. She was not trying to prepare in the way others did. There was no warm-up, no repeated practice on a keyboard, no final polishing of a piece. Instead, she simply stayed still, listening to the distant sound of the audience settling in. Every now and then, she could hear applause from the stage. It rose and fell like waves. Each time it happened, she understood that another performer had finished. Each time, she felt no competition inside her. She was not measuring herself against anyone. She was only waiting for her turn to speak in the only way she knew. Still, not everyone around her felt the same calm. Some of the staff exchanged quiet comments while glancing in her direction. They were not rude openly, but their expressions carried doubt. To them, she was not someone important. She was the simple piece in the program, the short pause between real performances. They had already decided what she was capable of, even before hearing a single note. One of them checked the stage list again and again, as if expecting something to go wrong. Another adjusted the lighting notes and spoke about timing. Everything was planned carefully, but there was no expectation that her part would be remembered. She noticed all of this, but she did not react. She had experienced this kind of quiet judgment before in different places, different rooms, different faces. People often judged quickly when they did not know someone's story. She had learned long ago not to fight those judgments with words. She believed music would speak better than anything she could explain. As the next performance ended, a soft applause filled the hall. It was polite, controlled, and short. Then there was a brief pause. That pause was hers. A staff member approached her and gave a small nod. It was time. She stood up. There was no dramatic change in her expression. No visible nervousness. But inside, She became more aware of everything. The sound of footsteps, the distance to the stage, the faint echo of the audience settling again. She walked slowly toward the stage entrance. From the side curtain, she could see the hall clearly now. It was large, filled with rows of seated guests. The lighting was warm but not intimate. It made everything look polished, slightly distant, almost like a display rather than a shared experience. Some people were still looking around, not fully focused. Others were sitting back comfortably, waiting for something more interesting. Very few seemed aware that she was about to begin. She stepped closer to the edge of the stage. For a moment she paused there, not out of fear but out of habit. It was a quiet moment she always took before playing, no matter the size of the audience. It helped her leave the noise behind. She took a slow breath. Then she stepped forward. The announcement was brief. Just her name, followed by a simple mention of a short piano piece. There was no introduction of background, no mention of training, no story attached to her. She was not presented as anything special, just a performer filling a gap in the program. She walked across the stage. The lights above were brighter here. They made the piano shine slightly, though it was not a new instrument. It had been used many times before. Its surface carried faint marks of age, small signs of countless hands that had touched it. She approached it quietly and sat down. For a moment, she did nothing. Her hands rested near her lap. She looked at the keys without rushing. The audience was still settling. A few people were whispering. A few were adjusting in their seats. The room had not yet turned fully silent. She did not rush them. Instead, she let the silence grow naturally. Slowly, the noise in the hall began to fade. Not because of announcement or instruction, but because something in the atmosphere began to shift. People started noticing that she had not started yet. That pause itself began to draw attention. When the room finally quieted, she placed her hands on the piano. The first note she played was soft. It was almost delicate, like a single drop of water falling into a still surface. At first, it did not change anything. The audience remained in the same state, some attentive, some distracted. But she continued. The second note followed. Then the third. The melody was simple at the beginning, exactly as requested. It was light, familiar, easy to recognize. It did not demand attention. It invited it slowly. A few people began to look up, not because it was loud, but because it felt different in a way they could not immediately define. Her hands moved steadily across the keys. There was no sudden movement, no visible effort. Everything looked controlled but not mechanical. It felt like she was not playing the piano, but allowing it to speak through her. As she continued, something subtle began to change in the melody. It was still the same structure, still the same simple tune, but it was no longer just simple. Carried something underneath it now, a feeling that could not be named easily. Some in the audience leaned forward slightly without realizing it. Others stopped looking at their phones. The room, which had been scattered in attention, began to slowly gather focus toward the stage. Backstage, a few staff members exchanged glances. They had expected a short, forgettable performance. That was the plan. But something about the way she was playing made them quiet down too. Still, no one spoke. She kept playing. The melody grew softer in some parts, deeper in others. It was like layers were being added, one after another, without changing the original shape. The tune remained recognizable, but its emotion was shifting. A few people in the audience began to feel something they did not expect. Not sadness exactly, not joy either. Something in between. Something personal. They did not understand why. She did not look at anyone. Her focus remained completely on the piano. Her posture was steady, but her expression had changed slightly. There was something distant in her eyes now, as if she was not fully in the room anymore. It was not detachment. It was memory. The music seemed to carry fragments of something deeper. Not a story she was telling out loud, but something she was remembering through sound. The audience, without knowing it, began to quiet further. Even the smallest movements, shifting in seats, whispering, began to stop. The hall was not completely silent yet, but it was changing. Slowly, gradually, almost without notice. She moved into the next part of the piece. The tempo shifted slightly. Still simple, still soft. But now there was a deeper emotional weight in each note. It was no longer just background music. It was becoming something that pulled attention inward. A few people felt their expressions change. They could not explain it, but something in the music was touching parts of their thoughts they usually avoided. Backstage, someone whispered that the timing was different from what was planned. But no one interrupted. It felt like doing so would break something fragile that had just begun to form. She continued playing. Each note now seemed to carry more meaning than the last. The piano was no longer just producing sound. It felt like it was telling a quiet story that did not belong to one person, but to many. And in that growing silence, the audience began to feel something they were not prepared for. The simple tune was no longer simple. The hall had started to feel different, even though nothing physical had changed. The lights were still the same warm color. The chairs were still neatly arranged. The stage still held the same piano. But something invisible in the air had shifted. It was subtle at first, like a change in temperature that people only notice after a few moments. She continued to play. Her fingers moved gently across the keys, not in a rushed way, not in a showy way, but in a way that felt deeply connected to something within her. The simple tune she had started with was still there, but now it carried layers that were not visible on the surface. It was no longer just a melody. It felt like a memory unfolding slowly. In the audience, a few people who had been distracted earlier were now looking directly at the stage. At first, they did not understand why. It was still a simple performance, at least in structure. There were no fast movements, no dramatic sounds, no sudden changes that usually grab attention. And yet, they could not look away. Something about the sound made them stay still. A man near the middle rows stopped adjusting his seat and simply listened. A woman who had been looking down at her phone slowly lifted her head. A few others, without speaking, leaned forward slightly, as if trying to understand something hidden in the music. It was not loud. It was not impressive in the usual way people expect performances to be. But it had a feeling inside it that was difficult to ignore. Backstage, the staff who had been busy moments ago were now quieter. Some of them had paused what they were doing without realizing it. One of them glanced at the stage monitor and then looked away, as if unsure what exactly they were hearing. There was no confusion in her actions on stage. She was steady, calm, and focused. But there was something different in the way she moved now. It was as if she was no longer fully aware of the audience. It felt like she had entered a space where only the piano and the sound existed. The melody began to deepen slightly. It was still built on the same simple foundation, but the emotion inside it was growing. The notes were not louder, but they felt heavier. Each one seemed to carry something unspoken, something that could not be explained in words. In the audience, someone quietly placed a hand over their chest without realizing it. Another person blinked slowly, as if trying to clear their thoughts. The reactions were small, almost invisible, but they were real. The hall was becoming quieter without anyone asking for silence. Even the soft background movements stopped. No more shifting chairs. No more whispering. It was not forced silence. It was natural. The kind of silence that happens when people are drawn into something deeper than conversation. She kept playing. Her expression did not change dramatically, but there was a slight shift in her face. It was not sadness, not happiness, but something in between. It looked like someone remembering something they had not thought about in a long time. The piano responded under her hands like it understood her. The sound was no longer just notes in order. Felt like breathing. Like something alive. A few people in the audience exchanged brief glances, but no one spoke. They did not want to break whatever was happening in front of them. They could not even fully explain it to themselves. One of the organizers near the side of the hall frowned slightly. This was not what they had expected. They had planned for a simple, short piece. Something light. Something forgettable. But the atmosphere was no longer light. It was something else entirely. Still, no one stopped her. She continued. The melody now began to shift again. Very slowly. almost unnoticeably at first. It was still recognizable, but it was changing direction emotionally. There was a sense of distance in it, like someone looking back at something far away. In the audience, more people were now fully focused. Some had stopped moving completely. Others sat very still, as if even small movements might disturb what they were feeling. A quiet, emotional weight was spreading through the room. It was not dramatic. No one was crying loudly. No one was reacting in a way that would draw attention. Instead, it was something internal, something personal. Each person seemed to be experiencing something slightly different, but all connected by the same sound. She played on. Her hands moved with steady control, but there was also a softness in her movement now. It was not about technique anymore. It was about expression. It was about something deeper than skill. The simple tune she had been asked to play was still there, but it felt like it had grown into something larger without losing its shape. A few people in the audience quietly lowered their heads. Not in sadness exactly, but in reflection. It was as if the music was reminding them of something they had forgotten inside themselves. The hall was now almost completely silent. Even backstage, movement had slowed. People were no longer checking schedules or speaking about timing. They were listening even if they had not planned to. She continued playing. The melody reached a point where it felt suspended in the air. Not moving forward quickly, not rushing to an end, but floating for a moment in something still and deep. That was when the emotional shift became stronger. It was subtle, but it spread through the audience like a wave that could not be seen. People began to feel a heaviness in their chest, not painful but meaningful, something that made them pause inside themselves. A few blinked more slowly. Others took deeper breaths without realizing it. The reactions were quiet, but they were growing. She did not look up even once. Her focus remained completely on the piano. It was as if she was no longer in the hall, as if she had stepped into a place only she could see. The melody now felt like it was speaking without words. It was not telling a clear story, but it was carrying emotion in a pure form. And in that moment, the audience was no longer just listening to a performance. They were feeling it. Not everyone understood why, but almost everyone felt that something ordinary had turned into something unforgettable. And still, she kept playing. The silence in the hall was no longer empty. It felt full now, as if the air itself had become heavier with emotion. People were still sitting in their seats, but their attention had completely shifted. No one was looking around anymore. No one was distracted. Every eye was fixed on the stage, even if they were not fully aware of why. She continued to play. The simple tune had changed shape again. It was still built from the same foundation, but now it carried a deeper flow, like a river that had moved from a shallow path into a deeper one. The sound was softer in some places, stronger in others, but always steady, always honest. In the audience, something quiet was happening inside people. It was not sudden. It was not loud. It was slow, like a feeling growing without permission. Some people felt a slight pressure in their chest. Others felt a strange warmth in their eyes, even though they could not explain why. A woman in the front row pressed her fingers together tightly in her lap. She did not move otherwise. She was trying to understand what she was feeling, but there was no clear answer. It was not sadness alone. It was not happiness either. It was something deeper, something connected to memory. A few seats away, a man leaned back slowly, as if the weight of the sound had reached him physically. He stared at the stage without blinking, completely absorbed. The hall remained silent, but it was not a normal silence anymore. It was a shared silence, one that carried emotion in every corner. She played on. Her posture remained steady, but there was something almost distant in her presence now. It was as if she was sitting in two places at once, one in the hall and one somewhere far away inside the music itself. The melody began to shift again. This time it carried a feeling of something unfinished. Not broken, but incomplete, like a story that had been paused and never fully explained. The notes moved gently, but there was a quiet ache inside them. In the audience, more people were now visibly affected, though still silently. A few lowered their gaze toward their hands. Others stared at the piano as if trying to understand what it was saying without words. A young man near the aisle wiped his eye quickly, almost embarrassed, even though no one was looking at him. He did not fully understand what had touched him, only that something had. Backstage, one of the staff members stood still near the curtain. They had been trained to focus on timing, on schedules, on flow. But none of that mattered now. The plan had become irrelevant in the face of what was happening on stage. Someone whispered softly that the audience reaction was not normal for a simple piece. But even that whisper faded quickly, as if speaking too loudly might break the atmosphere. She continued playing. The melody now felt like it was opening something inside the hall. Not in a dramatic way, but slowly, like a door being gently pushed open after being closed for a long time. People in the audience were no longer just listening with their ears. They were listening with something deeper, something they rarely used, something they often ignored in daily life. A few people began to feel emotions they had not expected. Not because the music was telling them what to feel, but because it was reminding them of things they had forgotten within themselves. A man near the back of the hall sat very still, his hands resting on his knees. His eyes were fixed on the stage, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. The music had taken him there without force. The woman in the front row now had tears quietly forming in her eyes. She did not wipe them away. She simply kept listening. There was no need to hide anything. The moment felt too real for that. Still, no one spoke. The hall had become a space where silence carried more meaning than words ever could. She played on. Her fingers moved slightly faster now, but still with control. The melody was building toward something, though it was not clear what that something would be. It did not feel like a climax in the usual sense. Felt more like a release. The sound grew richer, fuller, but not louder. It filled the room in a way that made people feel surrounded by it. Not trapped, but held. A few more people now had tears they could not stop. Some looked down. Some closed their eyes. Some simply stared forward, unable to move. It was not sadness alone that caused this. It was recognition. A feeling of being reminded of something deeply personal that had been buried under time and routine. She did not react to the audience. She did not look up. She did not change her expression. She simply played. And in doing so, she continued to open something inside the room that no one had expected. The melody now reached a point where it felt almost fragile, like something that could break if disturbed. But it did not break. It continued to flow carefully, gently, with a kind of quiet strength. In that moment, the audience was completely connected to it. Even those who had come without expectation, even those who had assumed it would be just another performance, were now fully inside it. There was no distance anymore between stage and seat. No separation between performer and listener. Felt shared. Backstage, someone placed a hand on a chair and remained still. No instructions were being given now. No reminders of timing. Everything had paused in a way no one had planned. The simple tune she had been asked to play was no longer simple in anyone's mind. It had become something far more emotional, something personal to each listener in a different way. She continued. The melody softened again, slowly lowering in intensity. Not ending, but gently changing direction, like a wave returning to shore after reaching its highest point. In the audience, people were now deeply quiet in their emotions. Some were still wiping tears. Others were simply sitting still, absorbing what they had just experienced without trying to explain it. There was no applause yet. No movement. No reaction that would break the moment. Only silence. A silence that felt complete. And she kept playing, guiding the final part of this emotional journey with the same calm presence she had shown from the beginning. As the hall remained fully captured by the sound she created. The music did not rush. It did not try to impress. It simply continued flowing, like a quiet river that had found its own path through the stillness of the hall. The audience remained completely silent now, as if any small sound might disturb something fragile that was unfolding in front of them. She kept playing. Her hands moved with steady care, but there was a change in the energy of the piece. It was no longer building upward. Instead, it was deepening. The sound felt closer now, more personal, as if it was no longer being performed for a crowd, but for something within each person sitting there. In the audience, emotions were now clearly visible, though still quiet. Some people had tears resting on their faces that they no longer tried to hide. Others sat very still, holding their breath at times without realizing it. A few closed their eyes not because they were tired, but because they wanted to feel the music without distraction. A man in the middle row leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. He looked fixed on the stage, but his expression showed something distant. It was as if the music had pulled him into a memory he had not visited in a long time. Nearby, a woman pressed her hand gently against her chest. Her breathing was slow. She was not crying loudly, but her eyes were filled with quiet emotion. It was not sadness alone. It was recognition of something deeply human. The hall had become completely united in silence. Not a forced silence, but one created by feeling. She continued to play. The melody now carried a soft heaviness, like a heart remembering something it had once tried to forget. The notes were gentle, but they had meaning that felt larger than sound. In that moment, something subtle but powerful happened in the audience. People began to feel connected not to her as a performer, but to something inside themselves. The music was no longer outside them. It was inside them now, reflecting emotions they had carried for years without expressing. A few people quietly lowered their heads, not in sadness alone, but in reflection. It was as if the music had gently opened doors inside their thoughts, allowing forgotten feelings to surface. Backstage, the atmosphere was completely still. No one was moving with purpose anymore. Even those who had been focused on timing and schedules were now watching in silence. The structure of the event no longer felt important. Everything had been overtaken by what was happening on stage. A staff member who had earlier shown doubt now stood with folded arms, watching without expression. The expectations they had carried before the performance no longer mattered. Something unexpected had taken its place. On stage, she remained fully focused. There was no change in her expression, but there was something calm and distant in her presence, as if she was holding a space that no one else could see. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It felt like a bridge between what she felt and what the audience was now experiencing. The melody reached a softer point again. It was not fading, but it was becoming quieter in emotion, like a story slowly turning its pages toward the end. Not in a sudden stop, but in a gentle release. In the audience, more people were now openly emotional. Some wiped their faces carefully. Others simply sat still, letting the feeling remain without interruption. A young listener near the aisle closed their eyes tightly for a moment, then opened them again slowly. They looked surprised, as if they did not expect such a simple tune to touch them so deeply. Another person leaned back in their seat and exhaled slowly, as if they had been holding something inside them for a long time and had just let it go. The entire hall felt different now. It was not a performance space anymore. It felt like a shared emotional experience, something that could not be repeated in the same way again. She continued playing. The melody now carried a sense of closure approaching, but not in a rushed way. It was gentle, like the final pages of a book being read slowly because no one wants it to end. Each note seemed carefully placed, not to impress, but to complete something that had been building from the very first sound. In the audience, there was a deep stillness. Even breathing felt quieter. People were fully present in a way they rarely experienced in daily life. A few eyes glistened with tears that had not yet fallen. Others had already let theirs fall silently. There was no embarrassment, no attempt to hide anything. The moment had gone beyond that. It was simply human now. Backstage, someone quietly leaned against the wall, watching. There was no conversation, no commentary, only understanding that something unexpected had taken over the evening. The simple instruction she had been given at the beginning, to play a short, simple tune, felt far away now. What had started as something small had become something much larger, something no one had predicted. On stage, she remained still in her focus. Her hands moved for what felt like the final part of the piece. The melody softened further, becoming almost like a whisper in sound. But even in its softness, it carried depth. The audience felt it. Many of them now sensed that something was nearing its end. Not because of any announcement, but because of the emotional shape of the music itself. It was gently guiding them toward closure. A few people instinctively straightened in their seats without realizing it, as if preparing for what was coming next, even though they did not want the moment to end. She played the final part of the melody with the same calm control she had shown from the beginning. There was no sudden change, no dramatic ending. Just a slow, natural descent of sound, like a leaf gently touching the ground. The last notes lingered in the air. They did not disappear immediately. They stayed for a moment, suspended in silence, as if the hall itself was holding them. And then, slowly, they faded. She removed her hands from the piano and remained still for a moment. The hall did not react immediately. There was no applause yet. Only silence. A deep, complete silence that felt different from any silence before it. It was not emptiness. It was fullness. In that silence, many people remained frozen in their seats, still holding the emotions the music had brought out in them. She lowered her head slightly in a quiet bow, and then she stood up. But even as she stepped away from the piano, the audience remained silent, as if they were still inside the moment that had just ended, not yet ready to leave it behind. She stood up slowly from the piano bench. For a moment, she did not move away. The hall was still completely silent. Not the normal silence of an audience waiting for applause, but a deeper silence. It felt like the room itself was holding its breath, unsure how to return to normal after what had just happened. She looked down at the piano keys one last time. Her expression was calm, but there was something soft in it now. Not pride, not satisfaction, something quieter, like someone who had just shared a part of themselves without saying a single word. Then she stepped back. One step, then another. Her movement was simple, careful, almost shy again, like she had not just filled the entire hall with emotion moments before. She was not trying to draw attention. She was simply leaving the space she had finished speaking in. But the audience did not move. People were still sitting exactly where they were, many of them frozen in their thoughts. Some had tears that had already dried on their faces. Others were still holding their breath without realizing it. A few blinked slowly, as if waking up from something they were not ready to leave. She reached the edge of the stage. For a brief moment, she paused again, just like she had done before starting. But this time, the pause felt different. Before, it had been the beginning of something unknown. Now, it felt like the end of something unforgettable. She gave a small, simple bow. No dramatic gesture. No expectation. Just a quiet gesture of respect. Then she turned and walked off stage. As she disappeared behind the curtain, the hall remained silent for a few more seconds. It was as if no one was sure whether it was truly over. And then it happened. The first clap came from somewhere in the middle rows. It was slow at first, almost uncertain. Then another joined. And another. Within seconds, the sound began to grow. Applause filled the hall. But it was not a loud, casual applause. It was different, carried emotion inside it. People were not just clapping because the performance ended. They were clapping because they had felt something they did not expect to feel. Some stood up without realizing it. Others clapped while still sitting, their expressions still heavy with emotion. A few wiped their faces again as they joined in. The sound spread across the hall, rising and filling every corner. Backstage, she had already stepped into the quiet corridor. The applause could still be heard faintly behind her, like a distant wave. She stopped for a moment and stood there, listening. But she did not turn back. She simply adjusted her hands together in front of her and stayed still. A staff member approached her quickly. Their expression was different now. The earlier doubt had disappeared completely. There was surprise in their face, but also something like respect. They tried to speak, but for a moment, no words came easily. It took a second before they simply said that the audience was reacting more than expected. She only nodded slightly. There was no excitement in her reaction. No attempt to take credit. No desire to extend the moment. It was as if, for her, the performance had already been completed the moment the last note disappeared. On the other side of the curtain, the applause continued. It grew louder again as more people stood up. Some were still clapping without stopping, their hands moving with emotion rather than habit. Others were simply standing quietly, not clapping anymore, just staying present in what they had experienced. A few people looked around at each other, as if trying to confirm they had all felt the same thing. No one spoke loudly, but small conversations began to form in whispers. Someone said they had not expected to feel anything like that from a simple piece. Another person quietly admitted they had been moved in a way they could not explain. A few simply nodded without adding words, because words did not feel enough. In the front rows, a woman remained seated even while others stood. Her hands were still placed together gently. She looked at the stage as if it still held something that had not fully left yet. Eventually, she stood up too, not because of the applause, but because something inside her had changed. Backstage, the staff began to move again, but more slowly now. The energy had shifted. The strict structure of timing and scheduling felt less important than before. Something had disrupted the usual rhythm of the evening, but not in a negative way. It felt like the event had become something more than planned. She walked further into the backstage area and found a quiet corner again. She stood there without speaking, her gaze lowered slightly. The applause was still going on, but softer now. It rose and fell in waves. After a while, it slowly began to settle. Not because people stopped caring, but because the moment had already been expressed fully. One by one, people began to sit back down in their seats. The hall did not return to its earlier energy. It was different now, quieter, more thoughtful. The next program was supposed to begin, but there was a delay. No one rushed it. Even the organizers seemed to understand that something needed time to settle. In the audience, people were still processing what they had just experienced. Some leaned back in their chairs with distant expressions. Others looked down, still holding onto the feeling of the music. A few people spoke softly, sharing short impressions with those beside them. But even those conversations were quiet, careful, like they did not want to break the memory of what had just happened. Backstage, she finally sat down on a simple chair. Her hands rested in her lap again. There was no sign of exhaustion, but there was stillness in her now. A calm that came after giving something deeply personal. A staff member quietly brought her a glass of water and placed it beside her without saying much. She gave a small nod of thanks. Then she looked forward, not at anything in particular, but into space. The performance was over, but the effect of it was still alive in the hall. People would remember that moment in different ways. Some would not fully understand why they felt emotional. Some would think about it later, trying to find meaning. Others would simply keep the feeling without needing to explain it. And she would remain just as she had been before all of it began. Quiet, simple, unassuming. But what the audience would not forget was not her appearance, or her name, or even the details of the program. They would remember the feeling. The way a simple tune slowly turned into something that touched parts of them they did not often visit. And long after the hall returned to normal, the memory of that music would remain with them, quiet but lasting, like something gently placed inside the heart and never fully removed.